Alright guys, so I'm going to be breaking down Napoleon and the Spectre, which you should have read yesterday. Today you are going to be looking at a poem with some similar themes, and then tomorrow you are going to be writing an essay over both of them. So bringing you back to the PowerPoint from Tuesday, the objective is scholars will be able to analyze how the author's use of connotative and denotative references to cages and confinement draws the reader's attention to the central idea and themes of the text. So going back to Napoleon and the Spectre by Charlotte Bronte, you should have read this yesterday. I hope that you were able to download the document and listen to the audio as it was reading it. I think that was very helpful. Napoleon is obviously referencing Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the Emperor of France from, I think, 1804 to 1814. So that's kind of our time period for this piece. A specter is a ghost. I hope you looked that up if you did not do that already. So just kind of highlighting some things that I want you to be able to draw your attention to. Again, you are going to be looking for explicit, which means direct, and implicit, which means subtle, references to cages, confinement, prison, or restraint. So we get that glimpse right off the bat when you have the Emperor Napoleon, which is a picture of him here. He says to his valet, which is like a butler, "Let down those window curtains and shut the casement before you leave the room." So right off the bat, he is confining himself, or he is asking his butler to confine him in his room. So that's kind of our first instance of the notions of confinement. And what I like about the story is that it jumps right into this very haunted notion right off the bat. So I'm going to scroll down here. Obviously, he hears the ghost, or he hears something, right? And he says, "Speak or I'll blow your brains out." And he is responded with a threat, right, which is a negative connotation. A short, sharp laugh and a dead silence followed. So you do have some negative connotations, dead obviously being negative, silence also being negative. Scrolling down to the next page, just as he was about to close his eyes again, the light of the 3 wax tapers, which burned in a silver branch over the mantelpiece, was suddenly darkened. He looked up, a black, opaque shadow obscured it. So opaque meaning not able to see through, black meaning black, shadow meaning shadow, darkened. We have a lot of negative connotation there. And just the notion of being enveloped in a dark shadow, that is also very confining as well. So we have this other instance of confinement. Obviously, if you cannot see anything, then you naturally begin to feel very trapped. And ominous being down here is a negative connotation as well. Scrolling down here, when he does see the form, right, the specter, the ghost, a form dawned on his astonished sight. It was that of a tall, thin man dressed in a blue surtout edged with gold lace. It wore a black cravat very tightly round its neck and confined by two little sticks placed behind each ear. So a cravat, you should have looked it up, but I've also included a picture here, so you can kind of get an idea for how the ghost is dressed. He is dressed very prominently, but he does have eyes that are glazed and bloodshot, which gives a very negative and ominous presence as well. And then the apparition spoke not, but gliding forward, beckoned Napoleon with an uplifted finger to follow. Controlled by a mysterious influence which deprived him of the capability of either thinking or acting for himself, he obeyed in silence. So this presence ends up controlling him, and he has this inability to either think or act for himself, so he is being controlled, which is another form of confinement, imprisonment, this notion of not having control over your thoughts, over your actions. And then the apartment fell open. So the apartment that was very closed and confined at the very beginning, now the solid wall of the apartment fell open as they approached. And when both had passed through, it closed behind them with a noise like thunder. So thunder obviously is a very negative connotation as well. And then it closed behind him. So something closing behind him is another form of entrapment or confinement as well. Scrolling down some more, he felt compelled, in spite of the rising indignation which almost choked him, to obey. So again, this notion of choking, not being able to speak, is another form of confinement or control, caged, imprisonment, all of that. And then they mysteriously arrive at a lofty house built on the banks of the Seine. The Seine is the beautiful river that flows all through Paris. I've included a picture there. So we do have a change of scenery, which is very interesting. It says, choose one of the words or phrases that you annotated and write down the connotative and denotative meanings below. So as you're reading, you should be taking note of words that I'm kind of pointing out to you that have either a negative, connotative, or denotative words. The figures that he sees when he reaches this room, a row of fine female figures, there's some alliteration there, richly attired, stood before this screen. They wore on their heads garlands of the most beautiful flowers, but their faces were concealed by ghastly masks representing death's heads. So you have a juxtaposition, which is one of my favorite words. It means to contradict or opposite. So you have this notion of beautiful flowers. Flowers are symbolic of life, of beauty, contrasted with this idea of masks, which are hiding, and death, which is the opposite of life. What is all this mummery? Cried the emperor, making an effort to shake off the mental shackles by which he was so unwillingly restrained. I should have highlighted unwillingly restrained as well. Shackles meaning handcuffs. So again, you have this notion of control, confinement. He is losing his ability to control himself. Right? And he was unwillingly restrained, so held against his will. Scrolling down some more, all of a sudden we have the presence of his wife, Marie Louise. And you would only know that this is his wife if you looked it up like I did. So all of a sudden his wife has now appeared. And he is really shaken by this. What are you in this infernal place too? Infernal meaning this notion of hell. What has brought you here? And she has a very interesting response. She says, will your majesty permit me to ask the same question of yourself? Said the empress. And there's a context clue, emperor, empress. So that's another context clue that indicates that they are married. And he made no reply. Astonishment prevented him. So she very smartly asked, well, what are you doing here? And he doesn't know the answer to that. He can't really explain himself very clearly. And scrolling down some more, he finds out that he has not even left, which is very interesting. The empress says, had you not better leave the apartment and retire to rest? And Napoleon says, leave the apartment. Why? Where am I? And remember, he thought that he had crossed, he had left his apartment, he had crossed the Seine, and he is now out in a random house in Paris. But when in fact, he is in my private drawing room surrounded by a few peculiar persons of the court whom I had invited this evening to a ball. You entered a few minutes since in your nightdress with your eyes fixed and wide open. I suppose from the astonishment you now testify that you were walking in your sleep. So now this thing has happened where Napoleon, who is the emperor of France, he has this very distinguished title, he has now walked into a party in his pajamas, essentially. Very embarrassing. And so he is not, in fact, surrounded by all these ghosts, as he thought he was. He has actually walked into a party and he is in his pajamas. And the story ends with the emperor immediately fell into a fit of catalepsy, which if you looked that up like I did, it means a trance of seizures that contributes to a loss of consciousness, in which he continued during the whole of that night and the greater part of the next day. So he fell into this trance where he was unable to wake up from. Now, what's very interesting about the ending of this story is that you can look at it one or two ways. You can look at it literally, which he just happened to fall into a catalepsy or a cataleptic state, or he actually was visited by a specter, and this specter had conjured this all for him before sending him into this loss of consciousness. Anyway, so I hope that this kind of helps break down kind of the notions of cagement or confinement, imprisonment, all that, because you will be needing to analyze that diction and compare it to the poem for today.